Hey, welcome everybody to episode 51 live from my drum room. Um, Today will be part two of Remembering Charlie Watts. I want to thank everybody who's watched and listened to part one and for all the positive comments. And I'm glad that it resonated with so many people. Um, it felt good to talk about it. And so I'm back with another installment of just some memories and some stories and some things to share about Charlie. I do want to also mention that since my last show, I've created a Facebook group called the Charlie Watts Appreciation Group, and anyone on Facebook can join it. I encourage everyone to join it. Love to get a nice big group there. The rules are really simple. There's just really two simple rules, and they are one, we're there to pay homage to Charlie and honor his memory, and two, don't be an asshole. It's pretty simple. There's a zero tolerance for anyone who doesn't play by the rules. So but so far it's been great. I think we're up to over 1,000 members in just a couple days, so it's great. So thank you, anyone who's joined. And if you haven't already, please join the group, Charlie Watts Appreciation Group. I also wanted to mention that if you don't know, I did a show back in November of 2020, almost a year ago, where I had Mike Edison on the show. And Mike wrote the fantastic book, Sympathy for the Drummer, Why Charlie Watts Matters. And Mike and I had been talking a few weeks ago about doing a part two. We are going to do a part two at some point. But I just thought I'd remind everyone, you can go back and look on my YouTube channel and find this. It's episode 17 from November 28th, 2020, where I spoke with Mike about this book. And he shares a great story about Charlie calling him, thanks to Don McCauley making Charlie aware of the book. He called Mike and they had a nice chat on the phone. And also I'm going to mention that I've made Mike's show into a podcast. So you can now listen to it if that's easier, download it as a podcast, and you can find it in all the usual podcast places, Apple, Spotify, and all those other podcast formats. So um, I think I remember what I talked about last time. So I'm going to try not to repeat anything or too much. I was going to maybe just take a minute and talk about the first time I saw the Stones. I mentioned getting into the band in 1972 through my sister, who is 5 years older, and she had actually got to see them that summer in July of 1972. I was a little too young, but by the time they came back 3 years later, 1975, I was able to go and see them. They did two shows at the Boston Garden, two consecutive nights, June 11th and June 12th. I went to the first night. I didn't look this up on the internet, but in my mind, I remember it being a Wednesday night. These are the things that crazy kids like me remember. I could be wrong about that, but the date was June 11th, 1975. And the old Boston Garden, if whoever isn't familiar with what that place was, it was a landmark. It was an arena where the Boston Bruins played and the Boston Celtics. And, it was a hockey arena basically, or basketball arena. It had no air conditioning. So during the summertime, it got really hot in that place. And that particular night, I remember my t-shirt. I think I bought a Stones t-shirt there, or I was wearing one. It was literally sticking to me. It was so hot and sweaty in that place. And of course, I didn't care. And I think I got my ticket after a bunch of my friends got theirs for some reason. So we weren't sitting together. Although I think we did end up sitting together by the end of the night. Either I moved to where they were or they moved to where I was. But I'll just share because we're talking about Charlie, and because there's lots of no holds barred geeking out going on. I was 14 years old. It was June of 1975, and I remember being in the room And when the first band finished, which I think was Billy Preston, who played with the Stones, I think he did like an opening. I think he opened the show. I vaguely remember that. I remember seeing Charlie's drums, his black Nitron Gretsch drums, being, out in the open now, where I couldn't see them before. And somebody, it must have been, I'm guessing Chooch McGee, maybe, or possibly Ian Stewart. But yeah, it was before Chooch. Chooch wasn't there in 75. So it was probably Ian or someone hitting the drums and hearing them through the house, when they just did the line check. And I remember thinking to myself, I can't really, this can't be happening. That can't really be Charlie's actual drum set. This is impossible. I can't be, in the same room as these guys. And then when they finally came out, that's another story, because in those days they'd come out really late. They'd make everybody wait a really long time between the warm-up band and when they came out, and they just got everybody into this frenzy, and people, throwing beach balls and balloons and all sorts of things happening in the seats. But it really whipped everybody into a mania by the time they came out. And I think they came on like close to 10 o'clock or something crazy like that. And they played 2.5 hours. But I remember sitting there for the first couple of songs, I was completely straight. I didn't do anything, no alcohol, no drugs or anything, which is why I think I can remember a pretty good amount of that show that was 46 years ago. But I remember sitting there thinking, that can't really be Mick Jagger. Like I can't really be that close to these guys that I could throw a cup of soda at them, which I would never do, of course. So it was one of those surreal moments for me. And as I've said, life-changing. I mean, I got home, I couldn't sleep. Getting home was another story too. By the time we got out of the show, the trains had stopped running. And that's how we got there, was public transportation. And we had to call one of our parents. I forget who, wasn't one of mine, but somebody came in to, Boston to the Garden and picked us up and drove us home at it must've been 1 o'clock in the morning. And it was a school night. These were the things we did back then. Anyway, so that's a sort of condensed version of the first time I saw them in 1975, but it really was just so life-changing for me. And then I actually saw them and I thought, I may never see them again. I mean, this was maybe, at that time, I thought this is probably a once in a lifetime thing, but I'm so glad I got to see them. They came back 3 years later, or they went on tour in 1978, and they skipped Boston that year for whatever reason. It was a more scaled back tour. I think it was fewer cities, and they had a huge record, Some Girls, at that time. And I never really understood why, but I don't think they came any closer than maybe New York or New Jersey on that tour. And I didn't, that was the summer that I graduated from high school. And I didn't have the sort of wherewithal in me to take a road trip somewhere to find them. So didn't see them in 78, but I will say, and I think other people in the Boston area might remember this, WBCN was the big radio station at the time. And the Stones were known for doing these surprise gigs at clubs where they just show up and play. And there was a rumor, WBCN was, I think, having a little fun with all of us, but they said there was a rumor that they were going to play at the In Square Men's Bar in Cambridge on a certain day. And this was in the summer of 1978. And me and a couple of my friends drove into Cambridge, and I'd never been to In Square Men's Bar, but we found it, and we sort of camped out there for the afternoon. And there might have been a couple of other people, but I think the people working there got a kick out of us, because I think they knew that there was this, unfounded rumor out there that the Stones might do a surprise show. So we were sitting, there was a drum set up that was nothing like Charlie's. And I remember my friends saying to me, is that Charlie's drum set? No, it's not. Definitely not his drum set. So we stayed there for a while, and I think we ended up just bagging it. And of course, they never played there. But I'll fast forward to a story. So I was working at this music store in Boston. Um, Started working there at the end of 1979. And in 1981, the Rolling Stones were rehearsing at Longview Farms, a recording studio out in uh, Western Mass, getting ready for their 1981 Tattoo You tour. And it was right about this time, September of 1981. Um, Ian Stewart came into Wurlitzer and bought Charlie some drum heads and some hardware. For me, I was working behind the counter. I recognized Stu instantly. I knew that the Stones had been buying some gear from us at the music store, and he came back to the drum department, and he couldn't believe that I knew who he was. I asked him to sign something. I don't know what I did with it, but he couldn't believe that I knew who he was and that I wanted him to sign something. He's very funny. And I wrote a little note to Charlie, and he told me that he would pass it along to Charlie. And I thought, okay, well, well, sure, okay. Now, this is 1981. This is 40 years ago. I do have the receipt, and I'll show you that another time. I kept a copy of the receipt of the stuff that I sold to the Stones to Charlie that day, so I can document that. And I think the date, it's coming up September 10th, I think was the date, 1981. So anyway, they went on tour that year. They skipped Boston again, but they did play in Hartford, Connecticut. And I went out there with my friends. Again, I didn't have a ticket for some reason. I think it was a last minute thing that I was able to go. And I ended up buying a scalper ticket a couple of blocks from the venue. And I remember thinking or hearing at the time that they were going to really crack down on scalpers. They were going to not let people without tickets within a certain perimeter. And sure enough, when I got there, I think there were cops or security people or something not letting people past a certain point. But I did find someone selling a ticket, and it was getting close to showtime. And the way I left it with my friends is, I'll just meet you back at the car at the end of the night if I don't get in. But I was certain I was certain I would. I wasn't worried about it. When you're 20 or 21 years old, you don't really think about stuff like that. Anyway, I bought a ticket. I think I paid about $50. I was prepared to pay more than that, and it was actually a really good seat. And it was a great show, and it was a different kind of show. Again, they were kind of evolving at that point. They were sort of a different band than the last time I'd seen them in '75, for sure. They had changed stylistically, you could say. Um, but that was, that was a little adventure all in itself, to go out there and see them in Hartford. I was glad I did. And then they didn't tour again until 1989. And I thought I was actually going to meet Charlie that year. And I'll tell you why. I was working at Zildjian by that time. I'd started at Zildjian in that spring of '89 in May. And the Stones came through in October on the Steel Wheels tour, 1989. And the band Living Color was opening that part of that leg of the tour. And Will Calhoun, the drummer, my very good friend today, who I met a few months into working, or actually very soon into working at Zildjian, but by the time the show came around, we were tight as could be, and he was inviting me to the show. I brought my sister, whose birthday was either the day of the show, October 1st, or around that time, but I brought her as my plus one. I thought it was fitting, since she was the one that got me into the Stones, all those years before, that she could come with me. So we went, we saw them, got there. It must have been after sound check. I was able to go up on stage and sit behind Charlie's drums for the first time and get a good look at everything. And I remember being kind of floored by, his old Speed King pedal and his cymbals, the crash that he played at that time, the 16-inch crash that you hear on all the songs. I assumed was an old Zildjian A. It had that thin A fast crash sound. Turns out it was a Paiste 602 with the inscription Arbiter Custom 602. And Arbiter was a drum shop, music store in London that basically Peisty put their name on the cymbal, but that's where Charlie bought it sometime around 1967 or 68, I think around 67, because he later told me that he cracked it in 2007 and he told me he'd had it for 40 years. So I would bet, he bought it around that time. But anyway, it was a chance to sort of see his drums up close. I didn't get a picture, unfortunately, but and I didn't get to meet him that time. And then they came through again in 1994. And this time, Lenny Kravitz was, that was the Voodoo Lounge tour. Lenny Kravitz was opening that leg of the tour. And Cindy Blackman, my very good friend, Cindy Blackman Santana, was playing drums with Lenny at that time. And she invited me to the show. And she actually told me she had spoken to Charlie about me and said, my friend from Zildjian is coming tonight. And Charlie, he'd like to meet you. And Charlie said, yeah, I'd like to meet him. So I got there. I remember, and the weather was really awful. And again, it was like in the fall. It was outside Gillette Stadium, Foxborough Stadium. And Cindy said, yeah, it's kind of crazy. I don't know where Charlie is. And when you're there to see the opening band at a Stones show, you can only get so far into the layers of security that they have there. And so basically, my pass that I had, that Cindy had got me to a point, got me into the Lenny Kravitz sort of realm of backstage, but there was no getting beyond a certain point where the Stones were. And I certainly understood that. I didn't think I'd be able to find my way back to find Charlie. I never even thought of it. I thought maybe there'd be an introduction. And so, but it didn't work out, and that was fine. And I'll fast forward to early 1997. They're recording in Los Angeles at Ocean Way Studios, and they're recording the Bridges to Babylon record. And my very good friend Kenny Aronoff had been invited to play percussion on the record. And my recollection of the story basically is that Kenny called me one morning. I think he hadn't gone to bed, basically. He called me and he was so excited, as Kenny is. He's just such an excited, upbeat, happy guy all the time. He couldn't contain himself because he'd just done a session with the Stones, and I think Jim Keltner was there, of course, Charlie in the band, and Don was producing that record, who Kenny had done a lot of work with. So it made sense that Kenny would be called in to play percussion. And so through talking with Kenny, I said, I'm going to try to reach out to Charlie's tech, Chooch McGee, who I don't know, but I know Chooch was a legend. He'd been Charlie's tech at that point for 20 years. So I knew who he was. So I left a message at Ocean Way for Chooch, and I just left a message with my name and that I worked for Zildjian, and I just wanted to talk to him if he had a minute. So sure enough, later that day, I get a call from Chooch, who was rest his soul, greatest guy. Man, just the greatest guy. I'm going to get choked up. And I said, we've uncovered these vintage cymbals made in the 1940s. I gave a set to Ringo last year, and I'd love to give Charlie a set, no strings attached. Just as a fan of Charlie's, I'd love to I know he loves old cymbals. These are vintage, never played, new old stock A Zildjians that I know he would like. And she said, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you write a letter and explain to Charlie what it is that you want to do and what these are, rather than me try to explain it, and send it to me, and I'll get it to Charlie. So I wrote the letter and I FedExed it out that day. And I probably could have faxed it, but I thought it would be better to just FedEx it with a letterhead and everything. And I went off on a clinic tour for like 2.5 or 3 weeks with Dennis Chambers. It was actually, I remember it being a very long, extended trip that I was leaving for in a day or two, but I was so happy to have done that before I left. I'm like, okay, I'm got that done. And we'll see what happens. A few days into my trip, I called in to get my messages at the office, and there was a message from Charlie Watts himself, introducing himself. Hello, my name is Charlie Watts. I got a letter. I still have it. I recorded it. Um, Maybe I'll play that another time, but I do have that voicemail that Charlie left me in the spring of 1997. I don't know that I could listen to it right now because I'd probably lose it. But I sent the cymbals when I got back. Charlie was able to use one of the crashes, the 16, on the record before they wrapped up recording, which was great. He also asked for a special thin swish cymbal that we made for him that he used on the B kit that tour, when the kit that he had out in the front, in the B stage. If anybody saw that, rather than the usual UFIP China, there was a 20-inch Zildjian swish, very, very thin with rivets, as is China on that. Anyway, I'll fast forward to that October. They were playing at Giant Stadium in New Jersey, and I was in New York during that time. Cheech and I had stayed in touch throughout that time, knowing they were going to be on tour, and I was planning to see them in Boston at Foxborough Stadium. But ahead of that, those Boston shows, they were in New Jersey, and I happened to be in New York for business. So Cheech said, "Why don't you come down and meet Charlie at Giant Stadium?" So I went down and got there in the afternoon. Cheech brought me in. I was there for the sound check, and afterward, I was kind of off to the side, and I had watched the sound check just kind of from afar, from a safe distance. And Charlie and Cheech are talking about something, and Cheech sort of points to me, and Charlie looks over at me and kind of gives me a hello nod, smile. Okay, that's him. Okay. I'm thinking that's Charlie's cue to get the heck out of there. And at that point, Cheech, I think, motioned me to come over. So I walked over and I met Charlie, and he was unbelievably kind and gracious and thanked me for the cymbals. And, we chatted, had a very pleasant conversation. And, he was happy to meet me. And, I didn't say much. And he, he was just very gracious, and we spoke for a little bit. I hung around with Cheech. I think I watched a good deal of that show from behind the stage. I can't remember now because I think maybe I had a pass that let me sit out by the soundboard for some of it, but I got into watching a lot of it from right where Cheech was, which was pretty great. But I did see Charlie one more time before the band went on, and he came over and said hello again, and we chatted, and he said, "Are you coming to the Boston show?" And I said, "I'm both shows." I said, "There's 2 shows. I'll be at both." And he said, "Oh, great. Then I'll see you there." And I said, "Charlie, by the way, there's a band playing at the Regatta Bar at a jazz club in Boston the night before your first show on the Sunday night. It's a Joshua Redman trio, and the drummer's name is Brian Blade. And Joshua Redman is a tenor player, and I think you'd really love the band. And it's right in Cambridge, Mass, Harvard Square, if you'd like to go." And he said, "Oh, I might be interested. Let me get back to you. Cheech has your number, right?" And I said, "Yes, Cheech has my number." So that was that, and so that was before the show, and then I went. I think that was like a Thursday night. I went home the next day. Over the weekend on Saturday, Cheech called me and said, "Charlie and I would like to come to the show at the Regatta Bar." So I called the manager of the club because it was sold out, and I trusted that he would not put the word out. But I said, "Charlie Watts and his tech want to come to the show. Can we arrange some more seats?" And he said, "I'll take care of it." So we went, I met them there, and I met Charlie and Chooch in the lobby and at the Charles Hotel where the Regatta Bar is. And I told Brian ahead of time, Brian Blade, that Charlie was coming and he was excited to meet him. And um, the manager of the hotel brought us in through like a back entrance, through like a little hallway, and brought us right to a table right in front of Brian, right in front of the drums. And it was great because not a lot of people really recognized Charlie, at least not right away. They did eventually, but it was jam packed. And he kept a low profile. He was not a very certainly wasn't a flashy guy. Um, but I remember we were sitting there, and he said to me, "What year?" Brian was playing an old Gretsch drum set, round badge. I'm trying to remember what color. They might have been Champagne Sparkle. I can't remember what the color was, but it was an old Gretsch set, which of course Charlie played. And he said, "How old are those? What year do you think those drums are?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, I'm guessing some 60s maybe. I told him I had an early 60s kid as well. And he said, "Mine's a 57. I'll bet mine's older." And, and I said, "Probably," or something like that. So anyway, it was an amazing show. It was great. Afterward, we went back and said hello to Brian and the entire band. And one of the first things I think Charlie said to Brian is, what year is your kit? What year are those drums?" And Brian said, "Oh, it's a 63 or something, or 64." And Charlie looked at me and said, "I told you mine were older." And it was just one of those, drummer funny moments where he was excited about his drums being older than Brian's. One of those things. But the rest of the story goes like this. So he invites Joshua Redman, Christian McBride, bass player, and Brian to their gig the next night at Foxborough Stadium. And they happened to be in town. They had a meeting with their management office, Ted Curlin, the next day. So they were going to be in Boston, and they all accepted. They said, "Yeah, we'd love to come." So Charlie said, "I'll set it up for you." And I remember getting to the gig and Chooch saying to me something like, can you come with me? Chooch or someone got a call, or maybe I did on my cell phone from Brian, that they were out front and couldn't get through one of the layers of security. So Chooch asked me to come with them to bring them backstage. So I went with Chooch, and we brought Josh and Christian McBride and Brian Blade backstage. But before that, I was chatting with Charlie. And again, now this is only the maybe third or fourth time now that it's still a very new thing meeting him. It's, he remembered me, and we just seen each other the night before, obviously at the show, but he was glad to see me, and we're chatting. And I swear he seemed almost a little nervous. And he said, "They're probably not going to come. They were just being polite when they accepted the invitation to come. Why would they want to come see this?" And I said, "No, Charlie, I really think they're going to come. Brian was excited about coming to see you play. They're going to come." And it was just, he was so humble in that way. He was thinking, why would these legit jazz guys want to come see me? And and they did come. And one of the things I remember that was so funny was they come backstage, and the Rolling Stones have the most amazing, elaborate catering situation set up back there. I mean, anything you can imagine, they have. And I remember Charlie saying to Joshua Redman, "Joshua, do you need anything? Would you like anything?" He said, "Well, I'd love a cappuccino." And it was almost like Charlie snapped his finger, and a woman comes out of nowhere. And, Charlie says, "He'd like a cappuccino." I'm like, "Yes," goes off to make them the cappuccino. So it's what you'd imagine it would be like back there. But he was so happy to see them. And we all sat together, Brian and Christian and Joshua and myself, and they were all digging the show. They were all sitting there just moving their feet, tapping their feet, grooving to it. It was, and I want to say that the next night when I saw Charlie for the second show, I told him, I said, they loved it, man. They stayed for the whole thing. I mean, when the Stones don't have anything after the show, so your best bet is to get out of there during the last song to avoid the throngs of people. 60,000 people making a dash for their car out of the parking lot. So we all sort of got out of there during the last song, and but I assured him, I said they stayed the whole night. They were there the whole time. So that was an old story going back to 1997, which was when I first met Charlie. And yeah, so there's lots more stories. And if you join the Facebook page that I mentioned, you'll see there's been lots of really cool pictures that have been posted. I've put some pictures up through the years, as other people have as well. And maybe I'll come back another time and talk about some of those pictures that I've put up there with a little bit more detail. But I did put a picture up, I think, when I first created the group of Charlie and myself. It was taken at SIR in New York City in early 1998, January 1998. So it was the continuation of that Bridges to Babylon tour. And Charlie, I think I came to New York for the show, but I was there for some other business, as I would tend to be during that time. And I went to a rehearsal at SIR, but ahead of time, we had made this shadow box award for Charlie, a lifetime achievement award that Armin Zildjian, the late Armin Zildjian, had signed a symbol, one of those vintage symbols that said to Charlie, keep swinging all the best, Armin Zildjian. And we made a little inscription on a plaque that said, for your lifetime of in appreciation of, your lifetime of music and contribution to the arts, and, some sort of inscription. So I'd arranged to present that to Charlie, and we took a picture. But that was the first time I remember being in the rehearsal room and at SIR, and Charlie greeting me with this big hello. And he was like, just so, I wasn't sure. It had been a couple of months since I'd seen him. He'd even remember who I was, but he said, hello, John, nice to see you. And that was the first time he introduced me to Keith and Ronnie, who were just so kind, so, I think they thought like, well, if this guy's okay with Charlie, he's okay with us, kind in the sense that they shook my hand and said, hi, nice to meet you, hello, with a smile on their face. But, and they ended up having a show, I think the next night or the night after, that I saw at Madison Square Garden. And that was really cool because, seeing the Rolling Stones anywhere, but Madison Square Garden, that's pretty special. They've had some pretty memorable shows in their history there. So it was cool to see them there in 1998. And that was the beginning of many, many more. I mean, basically every time they came through town from that time on, I would go see them. And there was never, ever a time, even as recently as 2 years ago, in July of 2019, that it was ever taken for granted, that it was ever anything that was remotely, sort of going through the motions of it, if that makes sense. I mean, it was always a special thing, not just to meet or to spend time with Charlie. That, of course, was so special. But seeing the Stones still had that same special feeling it had in 1975, the first time I saw them. There was still this magical adrenaline specialness to seeing them. There's just, it's hard to explain it, but anybody who's seen them enough times knows what I'm talking about. You could see them 100 or 1,000 times, and I still think you'd have that same, that same feeling. I mentioned in my prior show, Remembering Charlie, the time that I saw them at Gillette Stadium, the private show they did for the Kraft family. And that was a corporate gig, but it still had that same kind of anticipation. And it's the Stones. It's like there's something about being in that room with them that ignites a special kind of energy. um, and no matter how many times I I saw Charlie or spent time with him before a show, there was still that magical, special feeling of like, this is unbelievable that I'm sitting here in this room with him. Uh, you know, and in the last probably 10 or 15 years of seeing them at various times, we'd be in his dressing room, and oftentimes it would just be me and him and I. Um, and he'd have his practice pad and his sticks, and he'd be kind of warming up, chatting, and just a surreal feeling. So um, anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up for now. I appreciate you watching this. I hope I'll make this into a podcast, so I hope you'll download that. And I'll do another one of these at the very least, maybe even a couple more. And as I said, I am going to involve some friends, other drummers that I know would love to talk about their friendship and experience with Charlie, and uh, how special he was to them. Um, I'll just say one more thing, that I played a last minute gig the other night with my band, and I had just bought these drums just a couple of months ago, these 70s Gretsch, um, vintage Gretsch drums that I really love playing. But in honor of Charlie the other night, I brought out my black Nitron kit, which um, is probably not his most famous kit. His natural wood kit is his. This is for all you drummer geeks out there. Obviously, everybody recognizes his natural wood round badge 57 kit that I was talking about earlier. But in my mind, the black drum set is what I remember, because that's what he was using from 1972 until 78, when he got those older drums, the wood finish kit. So that's my sort of, I told him that years ago, and he kind of, um, he sort of dismissed it. He's like, well, yeah, I like these drums better, meaning his natural wood drums. But I can talk more about that another time as well. Some of the conversations we've had about his drums and cymbals. Um, so thanks for watching this. Um, Appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget the Charlie Watts Appreciation Group on Facebook, and don't forget to check out the Mike Edison show from November 28th, 2020. Sympathy for the Drummer: Why Charlie Watts Matters. And you can download that podcast episode as well. So I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, if you've made it this far. And yeah, thanks for remembering Charlie. See you soon.